Have you wondered, where do we come from? Have you ever had trouble wrapping your mind around the idea that the Earth is billions of years old? Or that humans have only been around a fraction of the time? Are humans intelligent animals at the top of the food chain, or are we more special than that? And whatever we conclude that we are, uniquely humans or highly evolved animals, where did we come from? And are we here for a purpose? And this is Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. The mystery we want to unlock right now is, where did we come from? Not just you and me, but all of us, humankind. How did man begin? In the last episode, we talked about the origin of life in general and how it developed into more complex forms like plants and animals. This time, we're going to make it all about us. What are we? And how did we humans begin? And what makes us human? For centuries, Western scientists answered this question with a worldview of science that was dominated by a biblical view of origins, that God, the designer, made man and everything we see. Scientists and theologians were not far apart on their thinking. Often, the theologians were the scientists, and vice versa. In the 19th century, that began to change. We've all heard of Charles Darwin's book On the Origin of Species. In it, Darwin argued for evolution of life from simpler forms to more complex ones. But he stopped short of saying that apes evolved into people. 4 years later, in 1869, Thomas Huxley took that step and suggested that mankind also evolved and came from lower-level primates. His book, Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature, detailed this theory. His central thought was that anatomical similarities between humans and apes made evolution likely. Then, with that line of evolutionary theory already crossed, Darwin wrote his own sequel, The Descent of Man, now applying evolution to humans and contending that humans evolved from primates. From these authors came the basic assumptions of evolution. First, that all of life evolved over long spans of time. Second, that any differences between us are the results of natural selection and some adaptations and mutations along the way. Finally, that similar design means that we must have a common ancestor. We would expect that if we all came from one common creature way back when, then those creatures closest in line with us would have similar anatomy. So, let's see if that's what we find.
It was Huxley who looked at the similarities between humans and primates, which everybody else, in addition to Huxley, was seeing as well, and assumed that because we were most similar to them, therefore we were probably most closely related to them. And that notion has been perpetuated right up to now.
We find that, yes, of course, chimpanzees are bilateral animals. They have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 hands, 2 feet, that sort of thing. But there is a lot more specific details that separates us from the chimpanzees.
Today, we have more sophisticated ways of determining the genetic makeup of an organism than by merely observing its external traits. Mapping of the human genome started in the 1990s. By 2003, researchers reported to have completed sequencing on the entire human genome, as well as some plants and animals. Genetic research continues today, and geneticists and other scientists are discovering new ways to apply this information to everything from disease therapies to genetically modified food crops. Although our understanding of how DNA works is growing exponentially, the basic principles of genetics are still the same. DNA is a macromolecule found in the nucleus of nearly every cell of every living thing, and it tells the cell what function to play. The DNA is packed tightly together into large units called chromosomes. Inside the chromosome is the heredity information that is passed from generation to generation. This information determines your physical attributes, like your hair color, how tall you might grow, your ethnic characteristics, even whether you will lose your hair. And on the most basic level, your DNA carries the information that determines what kind of organism you are. The key to what we are biologically, whether we are a person or an amoeba or a chimpanzee or a gnat, is written in the DNA. It's the blueprint of what we are. You may remember from science class that a DNA molecule has a double helix structure that looks like a twisted ladder. The ladder's rungs are made from 4 nucleotides known by their initials G, A, T, and C. They pair up with each other all along the DNA strand. An easy way to think of it is this. The DNA strand is made up of these 4 letters. Those letters make up words. Those words make sentences, sentences, paragraphs. In this case, genes are the sentences and chromosomes are the paragraphs. The letters and the sequence of the letters are what determine what the organism is. From these letter combinations, you can make something complex like an encyclopedia or a human. Or you can make something relatively simple like a stop sign or yeast. When a geneticist sequences the genome of an organism, the result is an extremely long chain of letter combinations. So, when geneticists are comparing the DNA of 2 different species, they are comparing where these letters match and where they don't. So, if Huxley and Darwin's theories from the 1800s are correct, and we all have evolved from a common ancestor, today's scientific evidence should corroborate that humans and their animal ancestors share similar DNA. And that's what some scientists say they find.
So there's a very common belief out there that humans and chimps have evolved from a common ancestor. And so many times even humans are considered primates. Okay? And the reason for that is they say, well, you know, if you look at the DNA, humans and chimps are 98 to 99% similar. That's what you hear in the media. That's what you hear by many scientists, unfortunately. But it just is not the case.
Everyone hears that the chimpanzee genome is 98 to 99% similar to human. But what does that mean? Well, this is an area I've been researching for the past 4 years. And the one thing that I've found out is that these estimates are based on isolated segments of DNA that we share with chimp that are very similar. It's not based on the whole genome.
So, for example, a lot of the DNA that supposedly is the same between chimps and people would be for something like metabolizing foods, breathing in air, which we call respiratory physiology, and the various processes that not only chimpanzees and people have to undergo, but also mice and rats and all the other vertebrates in the world. We all have to digest food. We all have to breathe in the same air. We have to drink the same water. So therefore, so much of the genetic material would necessarily have to be the same.
The human genome was sequenced first, and it took a very long time, and it took a lot of money. And the analogy that I like to use, it was like a giant jigsaw puzzle, okay? Because when you sequence human DNA, you don't get the 3 billion bases all in one nice strip, and you know how it all goes together. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle without a picture to go by. You don't know what the final picture is supposed to look like. Well, when they went to do the chimp genome to save time and to save money, and based on the evolutionary assumption that humans and chimps share a common ancestor, they simply took the human DNA as a template or a scaffold, and they just lined up the chimp DNA with it. Now, is that really how the chimp DNA goes together? We don't know. And so there's just no evidence to support that humans and chimps share a common ancestor.
There's 900 million DNA letter differences between us as a species and chimpanzee as a species. It's a huge difference. At 1% of our sequence, we're 98% similar. Well, overall, we're 70% similar, and practically that means 900 million letter differences between us and our supposed closest evolutionary relative.
And the differences are too vast for evolution to work, for us to evolve from a chimp-like creature or a primate. It's just not possible. The genomes are that different.
So perhaps the genomes of chimpanzees and humans are not as close as we're led to believe. And as to those comparisons in anatomy that led Huxley and Darwin to contend that humans evolved from apes, let's take a closer look at the evidence.
Humans and animals have a lot of similarities, there's no doubt about that. But there are also a lot of important differences between humans and animals, and particularly between humans and chimpanzees. There are a lot of physical differences, which you can see in external anatomy, the body hair, the ability to pick and grab things with your hands. The humans have a specific muscle in their forearm which gives them a unique capability to manipulate the tip of their thumb, which a chimpanzee doesn't have. And because we have that ability, we have a lot more creative ability with our hands.
Why does it matter if genetics proves that modern man evolved from chimpanzees? When it comes down to it, it's the difference between believing that humans are complex animals versus believing that humans are humans.
It's not just the external physical capacities that you see that make us different. Clearly, there is a major difference between humans and chimpanzees, and let's just jump to some of the obvious ones. Humans put men on the moon. Humans build hospitals. Humans use surgical instruments and operate on each other. Humans play baseball and go to ballets and write poetry. Humans do all of these things because there is not just a vast difference between us and a chimpanzee intellectually.
Beyond the physical, there are emotional and intellectual differences between humans and animals. A Labrador Retriever, for instance, has been bred to favor the genetic disposition to fetch. He can be taught the command to fetch a ball, or he can be taught that fetch means sit or roll over and play dead. The dog doesn't understand the meanings of the words fetch or sit. He's merely been trained to respond a certain way to a certain command. Right. A chimpanzee can be trained to use sign language to ask for a banana, but he can't put together a sentence about something more abstract like, tomorrow I want apples. An African gray parrot has a vocabulary of up to 3,000 words, but the parrot is mimicking sounds. She can't construct meaningful, complex sentences from those words. Secular scientists try to explain the differences between humans and animals in terms of evolutionary development. But the Bible has a much simpler answer. See, while God created thousands of kinds of animals, He only created 2 humans. This doesn't mean that animals don't have emotions and intellects. They most certainly do. But only humans were created in God's image.
So when we look at humans, you know, it's really interesting because even the simplest things are extremely complex. And one of the examples of that is the blood clotting pathway. Obviously, that's very important to us. So when we get a cut, the blood clots and we don't bleed to death. And when you look at how that happens, it's a chain reaction, so to speak, of many, many different proteins, or what are called factors, that are involved. That the end result, one kind of activates the next one, which activates the next one, and the end result is a blood clot. So by definition, the blood clotting system, or the blood clotting pathway, is irreducibly complex because it's made up of many different parts. And if even one part is missing, if even one factor is missing, blood doesn't clot. Those types of systems, those types of complex biological systems, or irreducibly complex systems, are very hard for evolution to understand how those things came about. Because all they're really left with is mutation and natural selection. Those are the main mechanisms for Darwinian evolution. And natural selection, well, it only selects from what's there. It can't create anything either. It can't account for the origin of novel things or new things. It can only select or call, so to speak, from the proteins or DNA or whatever it may be that's already there. So random mutations and natural selection, they can't do what evolution needs them to do.
Well, as Christians, it should really matter what our view is on the origination of human beings, whether we evolved from an ape-like ancestor, as is told in the evolutionary story, or whether we believe what the Bible tells us. Now, I want to make one thing really, really clear, and that is the difference between human beings and animals does not boil down to biology. We are not just more sophisticated animals.
Humans are humans, and animals are animals. That's not to say we don't share many characteristics with the animals on this planet. Our bodies are similar in many ways. Most mammals have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 nose, and 1 mouth, because God created that design for functional efficiency. But sharing similar features doesn't mean we're related. What makes us different from animals? One thing is, of course, our intelligence, and especially our ability to have the kinds of conversations that we're having now. Thoughts and ideas about life and its meaning. This is something very human and very unique, something that no animal shares with us. And it turns out that man's desire for meaning in life is what the Bible has said all along. One of the earliest statements about people in the Bible is Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God put Adam and Eve on earth to manage his estate, to hold dominion over the earth. All the plants, all the animals, all living things he entrusted to us. So, did God put humans in their current form in the Garden of Eden on the 6th day of creation, as Genesis tells us? Or did we evolve over millions of years? Our oldest life forms accidentally sparked into being from a primordial soup? Let's take a final look at this question by looking at a few of the problems with the theory of evolution.
3 points to remember as it relates to evolution. First, none of the major steps of evolution have ever been recapitulated in the lab. So whether we're talking non-life to life, or that first molecule to the first cell, or a bacterial cell to an animal cell, or single cell to multicellular creature, or jellyfish to something with a backbone, fish to land, you name it, any of those big transitions. Never been recapitulated in the lab. Second thing is that evolution happens too slowly for us to observe, by the evolutionist's own admission. So when we're talking about the essence of evolution, what Darwin's really proposing, humans came from some ape-like creature, we never see any changes on that scale. We're talking about speculation about the past. We're not talking about real observations in the present. All we see is small changes. So that's the second big picture point to consider. And third, Darwin gave a test for evolution. He said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not be built by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Roughly paraphrased. So he's saying, I'm trying to explain all of life. And if you find something, some species, some part of a species out there that you can't build step by tiny step, then my theory is a failure. The inner workings of the cell, highly interdependent, complex. You remove one component, system collapses. You can't evolve the cell. The cell makes up all life on the planet. So by Darwin's own pen, evolution should be rejected.
So, does it seem more likely that humans are uniquely made by God? That we have a special role to play here on Earth? Look at our magnificent ability, not only to think like a dog would think, but to think intelligently and symbolically. To think of the future and to imagine things beyond the here and now. The intellect to understand and the courage to explore the unknown. And what about our ability to feel empathy for others? To give of ourselves and help others with no earthly reward except knowing that it's the right thing to do. Consider for a moment our ability to create works of art, to write poetry, to sing, to dance. You know, as God's creation, humans are also unique in that we have a spiritual life, a connection to a perfect creator who has endowed us with responsibility for the whole of the earth. And that connection is God's desire for companionship with us. Now let that sink in for a moment. God made both animals and people. And animals are precious to God, but we humans are the only creatures that are created to have genuine, intelligent, compassionate fellowship with God. And here's the best part. This companionship, this fellowship with God, it's not just made for our statistical 72 years of life. It's intended to last forever. If there's a God who says that He made us and made us in His image, then our purpose becomes clear. Being made in God's image creates the potential for fellowship with Him. What Jesus did to provide salvation restores the fellowship. The Bible says, but God demonstrates His own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5:8. That's the source of meaning now. And it opens up an eternity that has a resolute future. I'll leave you with this. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Philippians the very same idea. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to do for His good pleasure. Doesn't that excite you? For His good pleasure. We bring God pleasure. Doesn't that boggle your mind? That's why He wants to be with us. And this should encourage us to soar in this life, empowered by a genuine relationship with God as part of His purposeful design that gives each of our lives meaning. And the key to understanding this, and even more, is to dig deeper into our origins, turning over every bit of evidence. Next time, we'll turn over the fossil record and see what mysteries we can unlock there. Until then, I'm Marcus Lloyd, and we're unlocking the mysteries of Genesis.